All right, let's dive into the latest U.S. jobs report. Now, on the surface, the headline number looks pretty straightforward. But trust me, underneath that single number, there's a really fascinating and kind of complicated story unfolding about the health of the U.S. economy. So let's get into it. So, this was the number that had everyone's attention, a forecast of 55,000 new jobs for September. Now, look, 55,000 isn't a massive blockbuster number on its own, but you have to remember this is coming after that really dismal 22,000 jobs we saw in August. So, compared to that, it starts to feel like, okay, maybe things are stabilizing.
But is it really that simple? Is the labor market actually steadying out? That headline number, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The moment you start to dig in, you realize the picture is, well, a whole lot more complicated.
So, first up, let's just quickly break down that main September jobs forecast. The big headline numbers everyone was looking at. Okay, so here are the key projections. First, those non-farm payrolls, what people call NFP, were expected to go up by about 55,000. Next up, the unemployment rate was predicted to just hold steady, right at 4.3%. And finally, average hourly earnings. They were forecast to see a pretty modest bump of 0.3% for the month. So on the surface, right, it looks like a market that's cooling, but definitely not falling apart.
But now, let's talk about the reasons for concern. Because there are definitely some cracks starting to show just beneath the surface.
And this is where it starts to get really interesting. While the official forecast was calling for that 55,000 job gain, a totally separate report from ADP, they're a huge payroll processor, so they see a ton of data. Well, their report showed an outright loss of 32,000 jobs. I mean, that is a massive disagreement between two major data points, and it tells you there's some real downside risk here. This uncertainty, it's made even worse by a trend we've been seeing for months now. You see, the initial job numbers that make all the headlines, they often don't stick. They have this habit of being quietly revised down a month or two later. This chart shows you exactly what I'm talking about. That first bar, the initial report, that's the big, splashy number that everyone talks about. But that second bar, that's where the number actually ends up after a few months of revisions. And as you can see, there's a very clear pattern. The reality has been consistently weaker than the first impression we get. Let's actually put some hard numbers on that trend, because it's pretty staggering. 6 of the last 7 monthly reports have been revised down, and the average revision isn't small. It's been a loss of 69,000 jobs from that initial number. But get this, the reports for May and June alone were revised down by a combined whopping 258,000 jobs. So the big takeaway here is that the labor market has actually been much, much weaker than it first appeared. Okay, but that's still not the whole story. To really get what's happening, we have to pull back and look at the broader context. It turns out there are other major forces at play, and they completely change how we should interpret these weak job numbers. And to do that, we need to understand a key concept called the break-even rate. It sounds technical, but it's simple. It's just the number of jobs the economy has to create each month to keep the unemployment rate from going up as the population grows. And here is the absolute key. That break-even number has changed. A really sharp shift in immigration policy has slowed down the growth of the labor supply. And since fewer people are entering the workforce each month, the economy actually doesn't need to create as many jobs just to keep things stable. And this is how it all connects. This slowdown in hiring, it's happening at the exact same time as a slowdown in the number of people looking for work. So, you see, while a gain of only 55,000 jobs would have set off alarm bells a few years ago, today it's much less of a red flag. And that brings us right back to the unemployment rate. This is why, despite pretty weak hiring, the rate is expected to hold steady at 4.3%. It's because both sides of the equation, the demand for workers and the supply of workers, are cooling off together, in tandem, keeping the whole market in this kind of delicate balance. This all leads to what economists are now calling a low hiring, low firing market. It's a really curious balance. In fact, Fed Chair Jerome Powell himself described it perfectly. He called it a curious kind of balance. And that phrase, it just perfectly captures the uncertainty of this economic moment, where things aren't really hot, but they're not exactly cold either. So to put it simply, this curious balance just means that companies are hiring less, but at the same time, workers are entering the job market at a slower pace. The two sides are slowing down pretty much in sync, And that's what's preventing the unemployment rate from suddenly shooting up. So, what does all of this mean for the Federal Reserve? And maybe more importantly, why should you even care? Well, make no mistake about it, this slowdown, especially when you factor in those massive downward revisions we talked about, has absolutely grabbed the Fed's attention. They're seeing that labor demand might be cooling even faster than labor supply, and they've already started to act on it. And here's their direct response. They saw this cooling trend and went ahead and cut interest rates by 1/4 percentage point back in September. And then they did it again in October. You can think of these as preventative moves, trying to keep this slowdown from turning into a full-blown recession. But after making 2 cuts already, the Fed is in a bit of a tougher spot. The bar for them to cut again in December is now much higher. If the jobs report comes in right around that 55,000 forecast, the decision really is what some economists are calling a coin flip. It could go either way. Which leaves us with this final and really crucial question. Financial markets, they're already pricing in even more rate cuts down the line. But given everything we've just talked about, this curious balance, the lower break-even rate, is it possible the market is getting way ahead of itself? That's the billion-dollar question that the Fed, and frankly all of us, will be watching very, very closely.